Hi, this is Kelly. You're listening to Vote Her In, a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive, where we look at the movement to elect our first woman president. Today on the podcast, feminist economist Heidi Hartmann. Hi, everyone. This is Kelly Pollock, and you're listening to Vote Her In, which is a series of episodes we do every other week in collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and author Rebecca Sive, where we look at the movement to elect our first woman president and all sorts of issues that come up around that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my partner in this venture, Rebecca Sive. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Kelly. I'm glad to be here once again. So for today's episode, everyone, we have a really special treat for you. A woman who I've admired for decades, an amazing, brilliant thinker, one of those geniuses the MacArthur Foundation talks about. And that's Heidi Hartmann, who is the founder of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And we thought it would be good to get together with Heidi to talk about in particular, the economic issues that face American women as we launch full steam into this presidential year. So that's our goal today, and we're just going to have a conversation about that and hopefully learn a lot. I have no doubt about that, as well as inspire all of you to consider these issues further and to talk about them in your own work. So with that, I wanted to begin by asking Heidi if she could share with us essentially an overview of the structural context in which American women work today and how it still limits our opportunities to achieve economic equality.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm really pleased to be joining you today, and this is my favorite topic, so thank you so much for starting with it. I've been studying women in the labor market basically since I started graduate school in the late 60s, and it hasn't changed that much, and yet it's changed a lot. So the way it's changed a lot is that, believe it or not, we do make more money relative to men. When I started out in the labor market, the wage ratio was about 60%, even a little bit less. Women earned only 60% for full-time year-round work, and men earned the dollar, and we got 60 cents. Now it's about 80 cents on the dollar. So we've closed the wage gap by half. We've narrowed it by half. That's pretty good, but it took a long time. And we have some estimates at the Institute for Women's Policy Research that shows it would take another 40 to 50 years for white women and for all women and for white women to achieve equality. But when you break it down for the different groups, for Latina women, it would be more like 200 years, and for African American women, 100 years to get equality with white men if present rates of progress continued. So that is the sense in which present rates of progress are too slow for everyone, but particularly for women of color. But this lack of equal pay, this is a constant of the labor market. One of the issues, one of the reasons it exists is that even still today, despite the fact that women have entered into so many more jobs that were closed to them when I was a young woman, I mean, there were very few women doctors, very few women lawyers. You didn't see women newscasters on TV ever, except maybe the person called the weather girl. So many jobs have opened to women, yet still the case that half of women work in jobs that are disproportionately done by women, meaning at least 3/4 of the people in that job are women. Think teachers, think nurses, think clerical workers. So many jobs are still done by one gender or the other. Think truck driving for men. And typically, for the typical similar kinds of requirements, the men's jobs pay more. So these barriers to getting women into the higher paying jobs, are still there and they're still strong. And another fact that hasn't changed, but has changed some, but not enough, is that women we're still doing the disproportionate share of family care and family work, and not only for our children, but for our parents. Although I want to say men are doing more child care and more parental care, especially parental care. But this means that women don't devote themselves as much to making money. I mean, someone has to do the care. And this also is a reason why they are not economically equal with men. In fact, in a recent study that I did with the economist Steve Rose, we looked at women and men across 15-year periods using a longitudinal data set. And we found that if you just count women and men who work at all during the 15 years, women earn 49% of what the typical man earns. And that's because women earn less per hour that they work, but they work fewer hours. They're still taking time out of the labor market much more than men do. And when you take time out, then your earnings are lower in all the other years that you're working. So, there's a lot that can be done to fix those things. And as I say, there has been progress in many areas. Not only are men doing slightly more child care and elder care, but we do have more federal and state and local support for child care than we used to, just to take one example.
Are there other examples you have, things that have sort of made some of that progress happen from a policy standpoint? So not just things that have happened and, sort of on their own, but things that have actually been put in place either at the state or federal level in policy standpoint that have led to some of that progress.
Well, absolutely. The public child care is important. It is publicly subsidized. Those dollars have grown at both all the levels, state, local, federal. I mean, one of the things we're seeing now is many schools offering first all-day kindergarten, which was not common. Kindergarten was typically half a day, and then all-day pre-K. And by all day, we mean length of the school day. And then often there's a parent-teacher association or another program that has an after-school program at that school or a before-school program at that school. When some of the public schools are going down to 2-year-olds, too. Head Start has expanded, which is primarily for lower-income people. So there has been public policy to improve childcare. Still nowhere near enough, absolutely not enough. But another great example is the 1978 Pregnancy Discrimination Act. I'm taking it for granted that we all know about the 1963 Equal Pay Act, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And it took a long time for them to begin to make a difference in women's wages, but they are doing that, and also the opportunities where women can work. Title IX, which dates from 1972, which allowed women to get equally into educational programs like law school, business school, medical school. Those were not open to women. Those are very important, but particularly the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, it doesn't actually give you a right to any benefits, but it does say that if your employer would give benefits, say, to a guy who had a heart attack, they would allow him to come back to work, and they might give him lighter duty and so on. Then, as a pregnant person, you would have the right to come back to work and possibly have lighter duty during your pregnancy if you needed it, or afterward if you had a complicated delivery. So the employer is obligated to not discriminate, to treat a woman with a pregnancy or delivery the same as they would a man with a similar type of disability, something that would, incapacitate them temporarily. So that made a huge difference. I don't know if you heard, I think it was Elizabeth Warren say that she had a job and she was pregnant and wanted to go on leave.
Right.
And they said, oh, yeah, our leave is you just leave. And right. I remember this. I was a young woman. I, had different jobs, and a woman would say that she was pregnant. Everybody would ooh and ah. A few months later, there would be a baby shower. She would be gone, and she was never expected to return. And this law made so much difference. This is when we started to see the really, really high proportion of mothers of young children working. And it's not that, I'm in favor of everybody working all the time, but in a world where you have to work to survive, this is the system we have, the capitalist economic system, and economics, I feel, is at the base of political power and other kinds of power. So to have equality, you have to have the same access to earnings in the labor market that men do. And being able to return to work and not be kept at home against your will is certainly very important. And then we got also in 1993 under Bill Clinton, the Family Medical Leave Act, which actually does give workers some rights. It gives, if you're working for a big enough firm and you have 1 year of tenure and you've worked at least half time, you have the right to come back to your job if you are ill or taking care of a family member for up to 12 weeks. And this made a huge difference also. In fact, President Clinton has said it was the most significant thing he did as president.
Speaking of significant things done by our government, something I've thought about for a long time, I wonder what your thoughts are, is it's when I look at the trajectory of women in public office, women running for office, you know, the real movement, albeit fairly gradual, has been since the Supreme Court adopted Roe. And I'm wondering whether you've seen from the economic standpoint as an economist whether you note that point as well as an opportunity when, as you put it a moment ago, women then have the will but also the opportunity to shape their own work lives.
Absolutely. It's incredibly significantly important. And there are, economists who have researched this and shown it, articles in peer-reviewed journals. The Institute for Women's Policy Research that I founded has recently put out 2 review articles which review this scientific literature showing that both contraceptive access, particularly the pill, which happens before Roe v. Wade, and Roe v. Wade in 1973 made a tremendous difference for women economically. Together, they helped women complete their educations. They also helped men complete their educations, by the way. There's an effect for men completing college when abortion and contraception is available to women. They raised earnings, particularly, I think this is shown for the contraceptive pill, raised earnings something like 8 percentage points, a huge amount, and increased women's participation in the labor force over their lives. Typically, the more educated you are, the more you work over your life, and the more you can control when you have children, how many you have, the more you're able to invest in your education and your career, and the more time you are able to spend getting the benefit of that education by working. So it's really made a tremendous difference. And were we to lose that right to abortion, we would see, I think, particularly hardship for young, poor women. Abortion is used not that older women don't have abortions as well, but it's used most by younger people. They disproportionately use abortion, whereas contraception is a little bit more used by, women of older ages that have more access to the medical system, may know more about it, may have thought more preventively, and so on.
Obviously we haven't made as much progress as you know, there's still certainly a gap. Are there particular policy things that people have tried to implement and haven't gotten done, or that we're still in the process of trying to do that you think would make huge differences and start to make that progress go even more quickly?
Well, just about everything I've mentioned we haven't done enough in. We don't really have strong enough equal pay laws. We haven't dealt with the concept of comparable worth. It was popular in the 80s, and we made some progress, but then it was challenged legally. So, we would need a new law to look at the differences between different jobs, but are comparable enough that they should pay more similarly. And this is done in other countries, Canada in particular, other European countries. They have more wage equality than we do. Most of the other advanced countries have better wage equality than we do. And of course, we all know they have more family and medical leave and more child care. And that, those two things are probably related. They appear to have more will also to treat women more equally. And they have different political systems. It's easier to run for office there, and women have made more progress in political representation in many of those countries also. There's another important area, which we haven't mentioned, is the ability to organize collectively at work and bargain for your wages. That's very important to workers. And unionization is very, very low in the United States now, especially in the private sector, down about 8 to 10% of all workers. And other countries are at, 30%, 50, 70% of workers in unions. And that makes a tremendous difference, too. It also creates less income inequality. You get more income equality when you have a stronger worker movement, a stronger labor movement. And one good thing that's happening in the labor movement is you do see a lot of women's leadership in the labor movement. Right. And this is a big change. And if we can now strengthen the representation, we will see more women in leadership and the unions doing more for things like childcare and women's wages. So that would be great. I guess I was reading your book, Rebecca, Vote Her In, and I liked so many of the points you made, but, especially the idea that we have to fight. You can't just sit around and wait for somebody to do something good for you. You really have to work on it. And I think, getting more women in leadership is an important step. You emphasize, the importance of electing a U.S. president, but there's leadership in business, in the military, in religion. All of those areas are areas where women's leadership is lacking. And it suggests that as women do have different life responsibilities than men still, they therefore have different political priorities when they do lead, and typically different priorities and different policies. So it is something that, we all definitely need to be working on.
Speaking of that, Heidi, the role of women in leadership and the fact that they have historically shown different priorities and greater interest in issues affecting women and women workers. I'm wondering whether you think that electing a woman president will, just in and of itself, a woman can be the most important person in the world, so to speak, hold the highest executive position in the United States, whether you think in and of itself that fact, that status, that message will have an impact in the world of economic policy.
Well, I think it will. I mean, it obviously depends on which political party she represents.
Right.
And, we saw in England, in the United Kingdom, that Margaret Thatcher was the first female prime minister, and her policies were not particularly socially generous or not particularly pro-woman. On the other hand, and we've seen now, I guess, the second woman from the Conservative Party lead the government there. It was consonant, though, with the time of, women's activism and a lot of forward-looking policies for women in England, not necessarily in her regime, but, throughout the whole period. The Women's Budget Project in the UK is fantastic at analyzing federal, well, I should call it national policy there, and what can be done with the budget to provide more programs for women. So they've improved family care, child care, equal pay. They've done a lot there. And even though those might not have been on the agenda of those two women leaders, and, you don't know how linked that is. I think of Janet Yellen, who was chair of the Federal Reserve Board.
Right.
And I think that made a huge difference. It was somehow consonant again in time with the, I don't know to call it a second revolution, a third revolution of women in the economics profession, where we organized petitions and letters, and we've now gotten quite a few new services from the economics profession for women. They've taken Me Too very seriously. They have an ombudswoman for sexual harassment complaints and so on. So her prominence, talk about a powerful international position. That was it for economics. And it would be, even more powerful to have a woman president of the United States in so many other areas as well as economics. So human rights, for example, I think it would make a huge difference. And, it's not clear what they would push first. I mean, I noticed Elizabeth Warren really came out with a huge child care plan.
Right.
As one of her early things. Kamala Harris came out with a huge equal pay plan, one of her early ventures on the policy front. So we're certainly seeing a lot of movement in this primary on women's issues.
Yeah. So just a quick follow-up on that, and then perhaps Kelly can close us out with a last question. I'm wondering whether if you were say advising, and maybe you are, I don't know, our two main Democratic women candidates for president, Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar, what would you say to them? Make this economic issue for women a priority and push it hard and talk about it everywhere.
Well, I'd probably say equal pay. It's an old chestnut, but women still don't have it. And they are aware, I mean, millennial women in particular are very aware that they have more education than their male counterparts, and why they're earning less is, a sore point for sure. And it's always the most popular issue in virtually any poll you take of women. There's so many ways you could talk about it. Teaching being undervalued, care work being undervalued, all those women who work in elder care. And that did come up in the last debate. I noticed that particular issue. And childcare came up as well. Also important. Childcare is a funny one. It's very expensive. And so it would be wonderful if we had it. It would help so many low-income families, many of whom are single mothers, of course, raising children on their own. But it is something that's time-limited, so it's not as popular as something like equal pay, which affects, virtually every woman. And retired women, too. I mean, retirement is when all the unequal pay and all the time you spend at home instead of working comes home to roost, Your unequal pay in retirement is much greater than your unequal pay in the workforce. So this is something that affects women, all women of all ages. So I would probably emphasize that, but I think I'd also emphasize, the importance of voting and running for office and by your candidacy, making other women see that they can take charge and lead change as well. And I'm not advising either of them. I am supporting one of them financially, but I'm not. So far, I haven't been advising them. I was kind of very wrapped up in the process of extracting myself as the president of IWPR.
Right.
The transition took a long time and was very involved. And now we have a new president, Nicole Mason, and I have a little bit more free time now.
Mm-hmm.
So we just recently saw the 38th state finally ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And of course, there's going to be a protracted legal battle now about sort of where we go from there. Do you think that if we manage to get the Equal Rights Amendment into the Constitution, do you think that will have an economic benefit for women?
Yes, I think it would. I think it would affect things like the military, for example, and further equalizing women's opportunities there. I think it's very important. And I don't know if it's going to be a legal battle so much. Isn't it going to be more of a political battle? Isn't it really up to Congress to decide? I'm not sure, the Supreme Court would take a position. I just don't know. But I think it's exciting, Good old Virginia right across the river from where I live.
Yeah, and when you look at that, and I guess just as a sort of call to arms, so to speak, speaking of the military as we close, I've been watching this and thinking, well, we're celebrating Dr. King's birthday this weekend and everything he did. There is an arc of justice, however long it takes, and I think for women who, whether we've been at it for years or we're just newly at this, this really is a time when we can make a difference. So I really want, on behalf of Kelly and myself, thank you so much, Heidi, for joining us and talking about this. And please, those of you who are listening, listen to Heidi's words and take her comment about equal pay seriously. I think that would just be, if we got to talk about it more, heard about it more, organized on it more, that would just be great. Yes. So thank you, Heidi.
Yes, thank you so much.
You. Thank you both. It was a pleasure to be with you. And let's hope women really come out in this election season and vote in November.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.